Hello. Let's talk about absolutism with some limitations. Obviously, we're going to leave France. We'll go over to England, but we'll also talk a little bit about Holland. Let's begin with the Netherlands and the republic that was formed there following their independence from Spain. It was called the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces. This is the time when Holland rose to be a very powerful country. Now, let me be clear. The country is Netherlands, and Holland is a nickname that is given to it. Holland is actually the name of one of the provinces, but it's the province surrounding Amsterdam, and therefore the dominant province in terms of population and economic power. So if you don't mind, I will use Holland and Netherlands somewhat interchangeably, and the people who live there are the Dutch. The Dutch really wanted to focus on manufacturing and on trade because they had very little arable land, and what land they had, of course, was not all of it, but some of it was reclaimed from the sea, and it was valuable, but Holland is really a small country. And therefore they wanted to develop their power through merchant activities, and they developed a very powerful navy and a lot of manufacturing. Hence they had a strong rise in the merchant class, and that gave rise to a limited monarchy. They did not want the king to have total power. The merchants wanted to have a major say in what went on in the country. So they made some restraints on absolutism. Let's read a few of them and we can get a feel for what the Dutch Republic was all about. The states are free to assemble regardless of whether or not the ruler summons them. No new taxes can be given without consent of the states. Acts of war must be approved by the states. No part of the realm can enter into a treaty with foreigners. Only the entire group, the United States, would enter into that. Gifts to the ruler were prohibited, trying to keep the ruler economically independent and above bribes and other things. Justice can only be administered by an independent judiciary. And finally, old customs and laws are to remain unbreakable even for the ruler. That is, the ruler and all of the people are to be treated the same under the laws of the land. The Netherlands has always been an area of great tolerance for other people, individuals who come in. They had religious tolerance, even though they had a state religion, the Dutch Reformed Church, Calvinist Church. But they also had cultural tolerance, and so Holland, even today, is a country with both religious and cultural tolerance. During the 1600s, the rise of Holland, or the Netherlands, in economic power was met with an equivalent rise in economic power from England. As an island nation, England also wanted to use manufacturing and trade as its vehicle for prominence. And therefore, these two countries fought a series of wars over rights to trade in various portions of the world. At the end of those wars, a compromise was made. The compromise was simply a division of territories, and so Holland was given control over Indonesia and the Spice Islands and that area of the world in Southeast Asia, whereas England was given control over the colonies in the Western Hemisphere. It was, in essence, a choice of Indonesia or New York. William III of Orange, the House of Orange, was one of the stadtholders of the Dutch. That means the ruler of the Dutch Republic, usually of noble birth, but not necessarily a king in kingly succession. There was some succession, but it wasn't absolute. Later, this king, William III, became King of England with his wife, Mary, and we'll talk about them a little later in this lecture. Here we see a map of the world, and we can see that England has control of territories in the Americas, and the Netherlands has control over territories down in Indonesia. We can also see where Portugal has control of some territories in South America and Africa, whereas Spain has control of territories in the Americas as well as the Philippines. France also has control of some territories called New France in North America. Now let's go to England and talk about the successor to Queen Elizabeth. His name was James I of England. He is the same person that we would call James VI of Scotland. So he was the sixth James in the Scottish line, and then he moved over and he became the first James in the English line. Same person. And his family name was Stuart, and therefore the Tudor family closed with Elizabeth, and the Stuart family began with James. He believed in being a divine right king, but he was a Protestant, and that limited him somewhat. However, the type of Protestant religion that he favored was the Episcopalian religion, that is the Church of England, where the church is very much a power structure. It has the king at the top, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then through the bishops, a power line down to the local level. The bishops are called the Episcopals, and therefore this church is called Episcopalian. Let me give you the contrast. If there are no hierarchies within the church and control is at the lower level, that lower level is called elders or presbyters. And so we see two organizational structures. The Episcopalian structure, which is controlled through the bishops, and that's quite authoritarian, favored by the kings, or the Presbyterian control, and that is control at the local level by the elders, and that is not favored by the kings. So James I was an authoritarian, and he therefore favored the Episcopalian structure of religion. He also needed money and wanted to encourage monopolies, so he would give a royal monopoly. For instance, he would go to a company that made china, and he would make them the designated china manufacturers for the throne. Or he would go to some other good and make them the designated manufacturers. These monopolies could also be given territorial rights. He might give someone the right to colonize in Virginia, and they organized Jamestown and named it in his honor. And they had a monopoly over their territory in like Virginia or India or Canada. The death of James I brought to us his oldest son, Charles I. Charles I was also a divine right king and very, very stubborn. He had economic problems. He was involved in some wars and tried to build prestigious locations for himself, and it was a difficult time because he was unable to get cooperation from Parliament. He dismissed Parliament, wouldn't allow them to meet for 11 years, and therefore he could get no new taxes. There was an absolute law in England that new taxes, could only be levied by Parliament. The Parliament also criticized the royal monopolies. They wanted to have an open competition for monopolies. Remember, the Parliament is largely controlled by the middle class, and they are merchants. And therefore the king decided that he would try and raise money by other means. He enacted exorbitant fines and duties, almost anything that he could to try and raise additional funds. Eventually, the problem came to a head because of all things, a rebellion in Scotland. Remember now, Charles I is not only King of England, he is, as a Stuart, King of Scotland. So one king over two separate countries at this point. The Scottish Rebellion arose because the Scots were angry at Charles because they felt that he was ignoring them. He therefore had to raise an army to put down the rebellion, and that meant that he had to have more money. Therefore, Charles was forced to call Parliament into session. And once they got into session, they refused to disband. That Parliament is therefore called the Long Parliament. There was conflict, continuing conflict between Charles and Parliament, eventually resulting in the arrest of many of the Parliament leaders. When that happened, along with other complications, war broke out between Parliament and the king. This is called the English Civil War. The king's army, sometimes called the Loyalists or the Cavaliers, fought against the Parliament army, and they were called the Roundheads, probably because of the shape of their helmets. But this war was a bloody war that extended over several years, eventually resulting in a Parliament victory. When the victory was secured, the victors arrested the king, took him to London, and there they executed the king. The ruler of Parliament became the protector of the Commonwealth. England ceased being a monarchy and became a commonwealth, and that protector of the Commonwealth was named Oliver Cromwell, a very strong Puritan and a very, very powerful military leader. He saw to it that Puritans dominated Parliament and therefore dominated the government. And in fact, whenever Episcopalians disputed him, he would discharge them from Parliament, eventually resulting in no Episcopalians of any power, at least in Parliament. And it's called the Rump Parliament, meaning that it's only a portion of what ought to be the real Parliament. Cromwell was not sympathetic to the rights of the common people. There was a revolt during his period called the Levelers' Revolt. They wanted to have a vote for all people in the realm. Cromwell did not like that. He wanted to have the vote restricted to only landholders and perhaps even only upper landholders, and therefore he viciously put down the Levelers' Revolt, and Cromwell ruled as a dictator. Eventually, of course, he died, and he was succeeded by his son Richard. Richard was not a strong leader. In fact, he felt uncomfortable in the role of leader of the British Commonwealth, and Richard decided that he should abandon that role, and he resigned in favor of a return of the Stuart family. The next person in the Stuart line was the son of Charles I. His name was Charles II. He had been living in exile in France. Therefore, Richard Cromwell contacted him, asked if he would agree to come back as king, but with limited powers. No more divine right. He would now have to be a Protestant and have to be subject to the rules of Parliament. Charles II agreed to those conditions, and he returned. He was a disinterested king and had very little influence one way or the other on politics during his short reign. When he died, he had no obvious heir. Therefore, his brother succeeded him. His brother's name was James II. There was a problem. James II was a Catholic. He was a widower. He had had 2 children, 2 daughters by a previous marriage, and both of them were successfully married to Protestant princes in Europe. One was married to the Stadtholder of Holland, and the other was married to a Scandinavian prince. everyone thought, well, even though we don't like Catholic to be prince or king, at least we can wait until James II dies. And then one of his daughters, his oldest daughter, would become the ruler of the country. But James II remarried, and his wife became pregnant. And when a little boy was born, it was obvious that that little boy would be reared as a Catholic, and the Stuart line would become a Catholic line, and England would be ruled by Catholics. The horrors of the reign of Bloody Mary were again brought into the vision of the people of England. They were alarmed, and they forced King Charles II to flee. He was not killed, he was not chased, he was just simply forced to retreat, or forced to leave the country, and he went over to France. At that time, Parliament then invited James II's oldest daughter, Mary, to come and be queen. She talked to her husband, who was the stadtholder in Holland, and they agreed that they would come and rule together, William and Mary. And William insisted that if Mary died, he would be given the right to succeed her or to rule without her. And so that was agreed upon. William and Mary came over, and they began rule in England. William was simultaneously the ruler of Holland. Well, James II became convinced that he could defeat William in battle. Therefore, James II organized an army, and he looked for Catholic support. And obviously, the Catholic support would be in Ireland, that part of the British Isles that had not become Protestant. And therefore, an Irish army was raised. William of Orange, William and Mary, took a Protestant army over to Ireland, and there he met James II on the field in Ireland at the River Boyne. And William was the conqueror. James fled back to France, and no major effort was again made to regain the throne. William continued to rule as a very strong Protestant ruler. Today in Ireland, we know that Northern Ireland is Protestant, and the southern part of Ireland, called the Republic of Ireland, is Catholic. And in Northern Ireland, they still celebrate this victory with Orange Day marches. And they are marches to remember the victory of William of Orange over the Catholic James II. Mary died, and after her death, she was succeeded by, her husband continued, and when he died, there were no children from their marriage, and therefore Mary's younger sister, Anne, was the next in line. She was the daughter of James II, and she was married to a prince of Denmark. She came back to England, and there she became the queen. It was during her reign that the United Kingdom was formed by Act of Parliament. The United Kingdom formally united Scotland, Wales, Ireland, both Southern and Northern Ireland, but then just called Ireland, with England into a new kingdom called the United Kingdom. Anne died without any children surviving. She had 13 pregnancies and 5 live births, but all of those children died before she did. Therefore, when she died, she was the last of the Stuarts. Parliament decided who would be the successor. They looked around and they found George I, a cousin. George I was a German prince in Hanover, and they invited him to come and be King of England. George I didn't speak English, but he agreed to come over and be the king, and therefore he began the Hanoverian line. In summary, let's take a look at the line of succession of the English kings, English rulers. Elizabeth I was a Tudor, and she was succeeded by her nephew, James I, who was a Stuart. James I was also King of Scotland. James I was succeeded by his son, Charles I, obviously also a Stuart. Charles was beheaded at the end of the English Civil War, and for a short period of time we had the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, and then his son, Richard Cromwell, his successor. Richard resigned and invited Charles II to return. That's called the Restoration, meaning the restoration of the Stuart house as rulers of England. Charles II then died and was succeeded by his brother, James II, also a Stuart. James was forced to flee in what is called the Glorious Revolution. Remember, he was forced to flee because he had a little Catholic baby son. The Glorious Revolution installed William III of Orange and his wife, Mary, who was also a Stuart. When Mary died, William ruled alone for a short period, and when William died, he was succeeded by Mary's sister, Anne, the last of the Stuarts. When Anne died, she was succeeded by a cousin, George I, who was from Germany, of the House of Hanover. We can ask ourselves this question: why are some people opposed to the rise of a limited monarchy? Why do they want absolute monarchs? Maybe a church reason. It may be because of the glory and prestige of an absolute monarch. Who could deny the prestige of Louis XIV? It may be because they feel that a powerful ruler will unite the country. And that could be true. An interesting exception to those who like absolute is the rise of criticism that is allowed in a limited monarchy. This is one of the values of English history, is that it had this period in which criticism was tolerated. Could not have happened in France. Under a limited monarchy, these people began to feel free and could say whatever they wanted. And let's talk about a few of these critics of the English monarchy. One of the most interesting was a man named Jonathan Swift. He was an Irish essayist and cleric. Therefore, he had Irish interests at heart, and he hated injustice, very politically active, and he wrote two tremendous satires. One of them is called Gulliver's Travels, and the other, A Modest Proposal. Gulliver's Travels is really a satire on English government, much like Utopia is a satire in a way on English government, but not as strong a satire as Gulliver's Travels. It really isn't a children's book. Let's just read about scientists from a portion of Gulliver's Travels when he was in the country of Laputa. In this country, scientists are those who control the government and control power in the country. The knowledge I had in mathematics gave me great assistance in acquiring their phraseology, which depended much upon that science and music. And in the latter, I was not unskilled. Their ideas are perpetually conversant in lines and figures. If they would, for example, praise the beauty of a woman or any other animal, they describe it by rhombs, circles, parallelograms, ellipses, and other geometrical terms, or by words of art drawn from music, needless here to repeat. In essence, he's poking fun at scientists because they can't even describe a beautiful person in common English terms. They have to describe them in terms of squares and rectangles and parallelograms. It's kind of funny. He also talks about lawyers. I want you to just listen to what I read and see if lawyers have changed over the years. I said there was a society of men among us, bred up from their youth in the art of proving by words, multiplied for the pleasure, that white is black and black is white, according as they are paid. To this society, all the rest of the people are slaves. For example, if my neighbor hath a mind to my cow, he hires a lawyer to prove that he ought to have my cow from me. I must then hire another to defend my right, it being against all rules of law that any man should be allowed to speak for himself. Now in this case, I, who am the rightful owner, lie under two great disadvantages. First, my lawyer, being practiced almost from his cradle in defending falsehood, is quite out of his element when he would be an advocate for justice, which, as an office unnatural, he always attempts with great awkwardness, if not ill will. The second disadvantage is that my lawyer must proceed with great caution, or else he will be reprimanded by the judges and abhorred by his brethren as one that would lessen the practice of law. And therefore I have but two methods to preserve my cow. The first is to gain over my adversary's lawyer with a double fee, who will then betray his client by insinuating that he hath justice on his side. The second way is for my lawyer to make my case appear as unjust as he can, by the cow to belong to my adversary, and this, if it be skillfully done, will certainly bespeak the favor of the bench. It is a maxim among these lawyers that whatever hath been done before may legally be done again, and therefore they take special care to record all the decisions formerly made against common justice and the general reason of mankind. These, under the name of precedents, they produce as authorities to justify the most iniquitous opinions, and the judges never fail of decreeing accordingly. Well, it's a lot of fun. I hope that no lawyers have taken offense. I have simply been reading what Jonathan Swift said in Gulliver's Travels. A modest proposal is an even stronger satire. It begins as a proposal to make money for the poor, starving Irish people. As you read it, you realize that the way that they're going to make money is by selling their children as food for the English. It is, of course, an abhorrent concept. Nevertheless, in satire, it becomes outrageously funny. Let me just read a little portion of it. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms, or on the backs, or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is, in the present deplorable state of the kingdom, a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound, useful members of the Commonwealth, would deserve so well of the public as to have his stature set up for a preserver of the nation. So he points to himself as a preserver of the nation because he advocates eating these poor little children who are, as he says, at the heels of their mothers. The second critic is Adam Smith. He's a Scottish professor, and he wrote a book called Wealth of Nations. It lays down the fundamentals of the capitalist system and free enterprise. He is critical because he believes that government has become too involved in commerce. He wants what is called laissez-faire, or keep your hands off, let them do as they will. And he advocates that there is self-interest at work, and because of the invisible hand of the marketplace, that is, everyone acting in his or her own self-interest, things flow naturally and there is no need for government interference. He says, through an invisible hand, self-interest guides the most efficient use of resources in a nation's economy, with public welfare coming as a byproduct. He advocates state and personal efforts to promote social good are ineffectual compared to unbridled market forces. Therefore, he believes that free trade and capitalism is the lifeblood of the society. Another critic is a philosopher whose name is David Hume. He was also from Scotland, and this was a period of time when Scotland rose in great importance. It was called the Edinburgh Renaissance. He was the leader of what is called empiricism, that is, knowing things through the senses, and because the senses sometimes fool us, he became a skeptic. That is, there were things that he just could not trust. And therefore, he advocated careful, rational acceptance of anything through the senses, but with always a hesitation as to its veracity. David Hume became very powerful among the English elite. Limited government is an important step forward in advancing democracy. This limited government of monarchs and republics shows that the middle class is growing and developing stronger. These changes can spur creativity, and creativity can spur additional changes. We'll consider next time how all of that contributes to art and music and architecture in the Baroque period. Thank you.